I'd been staring at the same 3 Photoshop layers for 6 hours a day for 2 weeks straight, and I finally just closed the laptop and told my boss I was unreachable until Monday. No cell signal, no deadlines. Just me, my truck, and 40 miles of empty desert. I found a dispersed site off a dirt spur, flat and open with a 360-degree view of nothing but scrub and sky. No other campers within sight. I set up my tent, cracked a chair open facing the sunset, and figured this was exactly what I needed. There was an old rusted water tank about 30 yards off, half buried in sand, probably left over from some ranch operation decades back. I didn't think twice about it. Around 1 a.m., I woke up to a scraping sound, something dragging against rock, way off past the dry wash. I told myself it was a coyote pulling apart a carcass, zipped deeper into my sleeping bag, and went back to sleep. I woke again a couple hours later, and my chair, the one I'd left facing the sunset, was turned almost 90 degrees, facing my tent instead. I stood there a second, running through excuses. Wind, maybe. Except there hadn't been any wind all night, and the chair was heavy enough that a breeze wouldn't move it an inch. I told myself I must have turned it myself and forgotten. I zipped the tent shut a little tighter than usual and told myself that was that. Then came the gravel, slow, deliberate crunching, right outside my guy lines. Not scattered, not skittering like an animal. One step, pause. Another step, pause. I lay frozen, telling myself it was a deer, maybe a javelina rooting around. But deer don't pause like they're listening. My rainfly zipper tab moved, just an inch, a light metallic slide, then stopped, like someone had touched it and thought better of it. I couldn't explain that one away. I grabbed my phone, flipped on the flashlight, and unzipped the inner mesh just enough to look out toward the tree line near the water tank. There was a man crouched low near the tank, motionless, watching my tent. He wasn't moving to leave. He wasn't moving at all, just crouched there, still, like he'd been waiting for me to look. I didn't say anything. I zipped the flashlight off, grabbed my keys and boots in one motion, and half crawled, half ran to my truck barefoot, gravel tearing at my feet. I didn't look back to see if he followed. I threw the truck in reverse and didn't stop until I hit pavement. I called the county sheriff's non-emergency line the next morning and gave them the coordinates. A deputy who drove out later that week told me they'd gotten 2 other reports from that same stretch of BLM land in the past year. Solo campers describing someone matching the same description, crouched near their site at night, gone by morning. No one's ever caught him. There's 40 miles of empty desert between where I sleep now and that water tank, and some nights I still feel like it isn't nearly enough distance. My husband and I hadn't had a weekend without our kids in 3 years, so for our anniversary we packed the truck and drove out to a tiny 4-site campground on the edge of the desert, just far enough off the highway to lose signal. It felt like exactly what we needed. The campground had a host trailer parked near the entrance, which made us feel safer picking a spot further back, tucked against a ridge with a view of nothing but open scrub. We strung up a little solar lantern outside the tent for ambiance and left it glowing when we turned in. In the morning it was off, not dead, just switched off at the base. We figured one of us must have bumped it walking to the car. Neither of us remembered doing that, but it seemed easier to assume than not. That night we heard a clang from the direction of the vault toilets, sharp and metallic, like someone had kicked a trash can lid. My husband said it was probably raccoons getting into something. We laughed about it and went back to sleep. Then we heard footsteps, slow, circling the outside of our site, crunching gravel in a full loop before stopping right at our dead fire ring. My husband sat up and grabbed the flashlight, but by the time he unzipped the tent, there was nothing there. He said it was probably the host doing rounds. I wasn't so sure. The host's trailer was all the way at the entrance, and it was almost 1 a.m. Still, we didn't want to ruin the trip being paranoid, so we let it go. In the morning, one corner of our rainfly was unclipped from its stake, flapping loose in the wind. Neither of us had touched it. That's when my husband remembered the trail camera, a cheap thing we'd strapped to a juniper the day before, mostly as a joke to see if we'd catch a rabbit or a coyote. We pulled the SD card and checked it on my phone. At 12:47 a.m., a man walked directly past the camera, close enough to fill the frame, wearing a reflective safety vest like a campground employee. He stopped, looked straight at the lens for several seconds, then kept walking toward our tent. We didn't wait to figure out what that meant. We broke camp in under 10 minutes and drove straight to the host trailer. The host, a woman in her 60s who'd run the place for years, told us no one on staff wears a reflective vest, and there was no permit check scheduled that night. She said she'd call it in, but her face told me this wasn't the first time she'd heard something like this. It wasn't until months later, when a ranger called to update us, that we learned a man had been arrested 2 campgrounds over for trespassing and impersonating a park employee, and that our footage helped tie him to it. Funny thing about camping in the desert, you go there to get away from strangers, and it turns out the only stranger you meet is the one who came dressed like he belonged. My sister and I have done the same reset trip every year since college. This year it mattered more than usual, since she was 6 months into a divorce and needed to remember what quiet felt like. We picked a slot canyon trailhead we'd camped at before, one of only 3 pullouts along a rough dirt road, usually empty except for the occasional car that rolls in after dark to grab an early trailhead start. We parked our 2 trucks nose to nose, cooler latched between them, and set up like always. Around midnight, my sister noticed the cooler latch was undone. Food shifted around inside, though nothing was actually gone. We'd both double-checked it before bed. We chalked it up to one of us not latching it properly and went back to the fire. A little later, we heard an engine idling somewhere down the wash, low and steady, then it just cut off. No headlights ever came up the road. We figured it was someone parking to sleep in their car before an early hike, which happens all the time out there. Then a flashlight beam swept across the canyon wall above our sight, once, then again a few minutes later, moving slow like someone scanning. My sister said it was probably another hiker checking their map. I wanted to believe that, but hikers don't usually sweep a beam across rock walls at 1 a.m. like they're looking for something specific. We were about to call it a night when we heard someone testing the door handle on my truck. One distinct click, then quiet. We both froze. By the time I grabbed the flashlight and got out, whoever it was had already moved off into the dark past the wash. We were still arguing about whether to pack up when headlights came up the road. Another camper, a guy who'd been parked further down, waving us over before we could even react. He said he'd seen a man on foot near our vehicles twice in the last hour and had come to warn us, figuring we hadn't noticed. That was enough. We loaded up fast and drove straight to the ranger station at the highway junction. The ranger on duty took our report, and while he filled out the paperwork, he mentioned, almost like it slipped out, that they'd had a handful of similar reports from that same trailhead over the past couple of seasons. Nothing ever proven, no one ever caught. He didn't seem surprised, just tired. We never did figure out if he wanted the truck, the cooler, or something else entirely, and after 2 years, I've stopped trying to guess. My wife passed away 18 months ago, and taking our 2 kids camping by myself was something I'd been putting off out of pure fear I'd mess it up. That weekend, I finally packed the truck, picked a well-known campground near the climbing area we used to visit as a family, and told myself I could do this. The sites there are spread out between huge boulders, which gives everyone privacy even with other campers around. My son had brought his bike and left it leaning against a rock by the tent. Nothing unusual. We roasted marshmallows, told bad jokes, and turned in early, exhausted in the good way. Around midnight, I heard rocks shifting somewhere past the boulders, like someone scrambling where there shouldn't be a trail. I told myself it was probably a rock climber doing something reckless in the dark, and tried to fall back asleep. Then I heard a voice, low, not clearly words, just a murmur from just beyond the boulder line. I sat up, listened hard, heard nothing else, and told myself it was another campsite's conversation carrying strangely on the wind. I almost believed it. In the morning, my son's bike, which he'd leaned carefully against the rock, was lying flat in the dirt, front wheel still spinning slow like it had just been knocked over. He swore he hadn't touched it. I told him it probably just fell. Neither of us really believed that, but I didn't want to scare the kids on their first trip. That night, I heard the zipper on our tent's outer vestibule pocket sliding open, slow and careful. I called out sharply into the dark, and everything went dead silent. Not the silence of nothing there, but the silence of something holding still on purpose. I didn't sleep the rest of the night, sitting up with my kids between me and the door. Near dawn, I must have dozed off sitting upright, because I woke to find a man standing directly over my kids' sleeping bags, inside our tent, close enough to touch them. He didn't run when I shouted. He just looked at me for a second too long before ducking out through the flap. I got my kids into the truck so fast I don't remember doing it. We drove straight to the campground host, who called it in immediately. Rangers found the man less than a mile away, and when they searched where he'd been staying, they found a stash of items pulled from half a dozen different campsites around the park, including my son's headlamp, which had gone missing the day before and which we'd assumed he'd just misplaced. He was arrested that morning. It turned out other families had reported things too. Small, easy to dismiss things, same as ours. My son still has that bike, dented front wheel and all, and every time he wheels it out of the garage, it takes me right back to that trip. Not to the fear, but to the two of us sitting up together in the dark, watching over each other, until the sun came up. I was driving alone through the Mojave Desert when a stranger told me not to stop for him. It was around 11:30 at night, and I was heading from Las Vegas toward Barstow. I had taken the smaller highway because I wanted a quieter drive and had underestimated how isolated the road would become. For nearly 40 minutes, I didn't see another vehicle. Then I saw a man standing on the shoulder. He was holding a flashlight. I slowed down but didn't stop. As I passed, he turned and pointed the flashlight directly at my windshield. I checked my rearview mirror. He was still standing there. I drove another 10 miles before my phone lost reception. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. There was a piece of paper tucked beneath my windshield wiper. I hadn't seen anyone approach the car. I pulled onto the shoulder, got out, and removed it. Written in black marker were 4 words: "Don't stop for me." I stood there staring at the message. Then I heard an engine behind me. A pickup truck appeared in my mirror. It slowed as it approached, and for a moment I thought it was going to stop. Instead, it passed. The driver was the same man I'd seen earlier. He looked directly at me through his window. I got back into my car and locked the doors. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe he'd walked from somewhere nearby. Maybe he'd been trying to warn me about something. I started driving. 5 minutes later, I saw him again. He was standing beside the road. This time, there was no flashlight. I didn't slow down. He began walking toward my car. I accelerated. He kept walking. Then my headlights caught something on the pavement ahead. A second note. I drove over it. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe curiosity. Maybe because part of me wanted proof that I wasn't imagining things. I backed up and picked it up. It said, "He knows you saw him." I immediately drove away. About 20 minutes later, I reached a gas station. There were 2 highway patrol vehicles parked outside. I went inside and told the attendant what happened. He became serious when I described the man. "You saw someone on Highway 40? I nodded. He asked what he looked like. I described him. The attendant quietly told me a man matching that description had been reported several times that month. But there was one problem. He had been dead for almost 2 years. The attendant said nobody knew why travelers kept reporting him. I left without asking anything else. The next morning, I looked at the passenger floor of my car. There was sand everywhere, and sitting on top of it was the flashlight. The same flashlight the man had been holding. I had never stopped for him. I still don't know how it got inside my locked car. What scares me most isn't that I saw someone who shouldn't have been there. It's that whoever left the notes knew exactly what I was doing, and they knew I would stop eventually. I stopped at a rest area in western Texas because I was too tired to keep driving. It was close to midnight, and I had been on the road since before sunrise. My destination was El Paso, but I still had another 3 hours to go. The rest area was almost completely empty. There was one other car parked beneath a light near the restrooms. I pulled into a space and reclined my seat. I intended to sleep for 20 minutes. Instead, I woke up nearly an hour later. The parking lot looked different. The other car was gone. I checked my phone. No signal. I started the engine and noticed something in the rearview mirror. A man was sitting on the bench outside the restroom. I hadn't seen him when I arrived. He was wearing a dark jacket despite the warm night. I watched him for a few seconds. He wasn't moving. I drove away. 5 miles later, I saw a pair of headlights behind me. The vehicle stayed far enough back that I couldn't identify it. I changed lanes. It changed lanes. I slowed down. It slowed down. My anxiety climbed quickly. I told myself I was tired and imagining the connection. Then I noticed the road ahead was completely empty. I pulled onto the shoulder. The vehicle behind me continued past. It was a white sedan. I couldn't see the driver. I waited until it disappeared. Then I drove on. 20 minutes later, I stopped at another gas station. Inside, I bought coffee and asked the cashier if there was another rest area ahead. He pointed toward the highway. About 40 miles. I asked if the previous one was open all night. He looked confused. Which one? I described it. He shook his head. That one's been closed for years. I laughed because I thought I'd misunderstood. He pulled out his phone and showed me a local map. There was no rest area where I'd stopped. I drove back the next morning. There was nothing there. No buildings, no parking lot, just a fenced patch of desert and an old concrete foundation. I felt foolish. I had probably stopped somewhere else. That's what I told myself, until I checked my dash camera. The recording showed me pulling into the rest area. The lights were visible, the restroom was visible, the bench was visible, and the man was sitting there. I watched the footage several times. Then I noticed something I'd missed. The man wasn't looking toward my car. He was looking directly at the camera, at me. Near the end of the recording, he stood up. He walked toward my vehicle. The footage suddenly became distorted. When the image returned, the driver's door was open. I was asleep inside. The man was standing beside me. He leaned toward the camera. Then the recording ended. I don't remember the door opening. I don't remember waking up. And I still have no explanation for why. When I checked the car afterward, there was a faint indentation in the passenger seat, as if someone had been sitting there while I slept. I don't use rest areas anymore. If I'm tired, I find a hotel, even if it means driving another 100 miles. I took a wrong turn in Arizona because I trusted my GPS more than my instincts. I was driving from Phoenix towards Sedona in late summer, trying to reach a small motel before dark. My phone kept rerouting me around construction, and eventually it sent me onto a narrow road that didn't look familiar. The pavement was cracked but passable. After 10 minutes, I realized I hadn't seen another car. Then my phone lost service. The GPS still worked. It showed a blue line continuing straight ahead. I followed it. 20 minutes later, I passed a mailbox. It had no house beside it. A mile farther, there was another, then another. Each mailbox had a name painted across the front. I started feeling uneasy when I realized every name was different. None matched any address I'd seen on the map. Then I saw mine, my full name, painted in white letters across a rusted mailbox. I stopped the car. For several seconds, I just stared. There was no possible way. My name isn't common, but even if someone happened to share it, the mailbox was positioned in the middle of nowhere. I got out and took a photograph. The moment I raised my phone, the GPS spoke. Continue for 3 miles. I looked at the screen. The destination had changed. It now displayed my name. I deleted the route. The screen immediately recalculated. Same road, same destination. I turned the car around. The road behind me looked longer than it had before. I drove for almost half an hour without reaching the turnoff. Then I saw the mailbox again, my mailbox. This time, there was an envelope inside. I shouldn't have opened it. I did. Inside was a photocopy of my driver's license, front and back. I dropped it. My hands were shaking so badly, I could barely unlock my car. I started driving. A truck appeared in the distance. I waved frantically when it approached. The driver slowed. I rolled down my window. "Can you help me?" The driver stared at me, then at the mailbox. He shook his head. "You need to leave." I asked him what the road was. He didn't answer. Instead, he said, "Don't look behind you." Then he drove away. I followed his warning. I kept my eyes forward, but after several minutes, curiosity became unbearable. I glanced into the rearview mirror. There was a person standing beside my car. I slammed the brakes. The road behind me was empty. No person, no truck, nothing. I drove until I found the main highway. My phone regained service immediately. The GPS returned to normal. When I reached the motel, I checked the photograph I'd taken. The mailbox was there, but the name had disappeared. In its place were 4 numbers. My birth year. I never told anyone about the envelope. I threw it away. A month later, I received a letter at my apartment. No return address. Inside was a photograph. It showed my car parked beside the mailbox. The photograph had been taken from behind me, and I was standing beside the car, looking directly at the camera. I don't remember anyone taking it. I don't remember turning around. But the date printed on the photograph was the same date as my drive. I've deleted every GPS app from my phone since then. It didn't help. Every once in a while, when I'm driving somewhere unfamiliar, my phone lights up by itself. No notification, no call, just a map, and a blue line leading somewhere I have never been. I was crossing New Mexico alone when the radio started broadcasting my own voice. It happened around midnight. I had been driving for hours along a 2-lane highway with nothing but black desert on either side. My GPS had lost its signal somewhere near the state line, but I wasn't worried. I had enough fuel, a paper map, and a hotel reservation in a town about 2 hours ahead. Then the radio crackled. At first, it was just static. I turned the volume down. A few seconds later, I heard a man's voice. "Take the next left." I looked at the radio. The voice sounded familiar. Too familiar. It was mine. I turned the radio off. The voice continued. "Don't take the highway." I pulled the car onto the shoulder. Silence. I sat there with both hands on the steering wheel, trying to explain what had happened. Maybe another frequency had crossed with the radio. Maybe exhaustion was affecting me. I switched it back on. Music. A country song. I laughed nervously and continued driving. 10 minutes later, the voice returned. "There's a truck behind you." I looked in the mirror. There was. A white pickup was approaching quickly. The voice spoke again. "Slow down." I did. The truck passed me. Nothing unusual happened, but my hands were sweating. Then the voice said something that made my stomach drop. "You're going to remember this wrong." I turned the radio off again. This time I kept it off. For the next hour, nothing happened. Eventually, I saw a rest area sign. I pulled in. The parking lot was empty except for one sedan near the far end. I got out, stretched my legs, and walked toward the restroom. Halfway there, I heard my voice behind me. "Don't go inside." I spun around. The radio was still inside my car. I stood frozen. Then I noticed the sedan. Its driver was watching me. I got back into my car and locked the doors. The sedan started its engine. I started mine. It followed me onto the highway. For 20 minutes it stayed behind me. Then it disappeared. I finally reached the hotel around 2 in the morning. The clerk gave me a key and barely looked up. In my room, I couldn't sleep. At 3:14 a.m., my phone rang. No caller ID. I answered. Static. Then my own voice whispered, "You shouldn't have stopped." I hung up. The next morning, I asked the clerk if there had been any calls to my room overnight. He checked the computer. No. I showed him my phone. He looked confused. Then he asked which room I was staying in. I told him. His expression changed. "That room hasn't been rented in 6 months." I laughed. I thought he was making some kind of mistake. Then he showed me the reservation screen. My name wasn't there. Neither was my credit card. I drove home that afternoon without stopping. When I checked my phone later, there was one new voicemail. It was recorded at 3:14 a.m. I listened once. My own voice said, "Next time, keep driving." I deleted it. But sometimes, late at night, my car radio turns itself on, and before the music starts, I hear myself breathing.
I'd just left a 9-year relationship and taken a job 3 states away, the kind of fresh start you tell yourself you need. About 2 months ago, I decided to drive the whole way instead of fly. Just me and too many hours of desert highway to think. I found a motel about 40 miles past the last gas station, one of those single-story strips with a buzzing neon sign that still had half its letters lit. The clerk said I was lucky. It was the only place open for miles, and most nights in the off-season, I'd have the whole row to myself. My room was at the end, next to a laundry room whose door didn't quite latch shut, just clicked against the frame and drifted open an inch. I figured it was old hardware and didn't think twice about it. Around 1 a.m., I heard gravel crunching somewhere out past the parking lot. Slow, uneven, like someone walking without a flashlight. I told myself it was probably a coyote or another guest pulling in late. I checked that my door was locked and went back to bed. Then, maybe an hour later, I heard it again, closer this time, right along the side of the building, pausing outside my window before moving on. My rational brain wanted to blame the wind, but there wasn't any wind that night. I lay there a long time, listening, before I convinced myself I'd imagined the pause. Around 3 a.m., I got up for water and noticed the laundry room door was standing wide open, not just ajar. The coin machine inside had been shifted a few inches off the wall, like something had been braced against it. I checked my phone and saw the motel's front office camera feed, which the clerk had shown me stretched across an app the owners used. The timestamp showed a shape crossing the frame at 2:47 a.m. Not an animal, a person, moving low, hugging the wall the whole way down toward my end of the building. There was no explanation left that made sense. I called the front desk with my hand shaking. While I was on the phone, someone knocked twice on my window. Not the door, the window. If you're new here, everything on this channel comes from real accounts. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next videos. When I turned, there was a man standing just outside it, still as a photograph. He wore a reflective vest like a maintenance worker, and when he saw me look, he tilted his head slightly and said, muffled through the glass, "Ma'am, I just need you to open up. There's a water issue in your unit." There was no maintenance scheduled, no water issue. He didn't move, didn't blink, just kept watching me watch him. I grabbed my keys and my phone, didn't put on shoes, and ran straight for my car. I didn't look back once until I was already pulling onto the highway, and even then I only looked in the mirror. The clerk called the police once I explained what happened from a gas station 20 minutes down the road. Officers confirmed there was no maintenance staff on shift that night, and the front desk had no employee matching that description on payroll, ever. They pulled the footage and matched the timestamp exactly to what I'd seen, but by the time they searched the property, whoever it was had vanished into the desert on foot. They never found him, and no one at that motel could explain who he was or how long he'd been circling the building before that night. There was nothing but glass between us that whole time, and I never would have known he was out there at all if I hadn't gotten up for water. I'd just gotten laid off after 4 years at the same company, and my best friend Priya insisted a road trip would shake the funk loose. No destinations, just the two of us and the highway. About 6 weeks ago, we found a cabin listing outside a tiny desert town, the kind of place with one gas station and a whole lot of nothing else. The cabin sat off the main road behind a stand of dead-looking trees, advertised as total privacy, total quiet. Exactly what we wanted after a year of Zoom calls and open floor plans. There was a rocking chair on the porch that the host mentioned in passing, said guests liked to leave it facing the road so they'd see the sunset. We didn't think much of it, just figured it was a nice touch. The first night, I woke up to what sounded like footsteps on gravel, slow, deliberate, circling somewhere past the tree line. Priya woke up too and said it was probably deer. She'd grown up rural, said deer walk heavier than people expect. I believed her, mostly, and we both went back to sleep. The second night, the sound came again, except this time it stopped directly behind the cabin, near the propane tank, for almost a full minute before moving off. Priya wasn't as quick to explain it away this time. She said maybe it was the property owner checking something, but neither of us really believed that. Not at that hour. The third morning, I went to check the porch and found the rocking chair turned a full 180 degrees, facing the cabin instead of the road. Priya swore she hadn't touched it, and neither had I. That night, she stayed up reading in the front room while I slept, and around 2 a.m., she heard the deadbolt on the back door turn, slowly, from a lock position to unlocked, even though we'd both checked it ourselves before bed. She watched it happen. There was no explanation left that made sense. We sat together in the front room with every light on, and that's when we saw him, a man standing just past the tree line, not moving, just watching the cabin with his hands loose at his sides, like he had nowhere else to be. He didn't approach, he didn't speak. He just stood there long enough for both of us to be certain he was real, and then, without any hurry at all, he turned and walked deeper into the trees. We grabbed our bags, didn't bother packing properly, and were in the car within 2 minutes. I drove the whole way to the gas station in town, with my hands locked at 10 and 2, and neither of us said a word until we were parked under the lights. We called the property host from the gas station, and after a long pause, she admitted something she hadn't mentioned in the listing. 2 other groups that season had reported a man matching the same description near the tree line, one of whom had also had a door unlocked from the inside overnight. She said she'd meant to install cameras but never got around to it, and that she was so sorry, but had assumed it was nothing serious enough to warn people about. Funny, the listing bragged about total privacy. Turns out we weren't the only ones out there who noticed it. My mum had been begging me to visit since my dad passed, and about a month ago I finally packed up my 2 kids and made the 11-hour drive out to see her, cutting straight across 200 miles of empty desert highway to save time. We stopped for the night at a rest area that had a small motor inn attached, more of a converted double-wide than an actual hotel, but it had 2 beds and a working AC, and my 6-year-old was already asleep in the back seat. The owner, an older man who ran the place alone, mentioned that the ice machine outside our room stuck sometimes and not to force the door if it jammed. It seemed like a throwaway comment, the kind hosts make about every property, so I didn't ask any follow-up questions. Around midnight, my older son, who's 11, said he heard someone dragging something across the gravel lot, slow scraping sounds that stopped and started. I told him it was probably the owner moving trash cans, since I could see a dumpster near the office. He seemed satisfied enough to fall back asleep. An hour later he woke me up again, said the scraping sound had moved to right outside our door this time, and he swore he saw the door handle move slightly. I told him he was half asleep and dreaming, but I got up and checked the lock myself, and it was still engaged. Still, I left the bathroom light on for the rest of the night, telling myself it was just for him. The next morning, the ice machine door was standing wide open, and inside, someone had clearly been sitting. There were fresh handprints pressed into the frost on the interior wall, at about waist height, like someone had been crouched inside it recently. I mentioned it to the owner, and his face changed. He told me a guest 2 doors down had also complained overnight about hearing someone try their window latch, and when he checked her room himself, the latch had visible fresh scratch marks that hadn't been there the day before. 2 separate people, 2 separate rooms, matching the same story. There was no explanation left that made sense. While I was packing the car, I opened the trunk and found a man already crouched behind it, tucked into the gap between our car and the ice machine. So close, I nearly stepped on him. He didn't run. He just looked up at me, calm, and asked if I needed help with the bags, like he'd been standing there waiting for an invitation the whole time. I grabbed my son by the arm, left the trunk half-loaded, and got both kids in the car. I didn't stop until we hit the next town 40 minutes later, hands shaking so hard I could barely hold the wheel straight. The owner called it in immediately, and because the man was still on foot with nowhere to go in that stretch of desert, a deputy actually caught him less than 2 miles down the highway, less than an hour later. He gave no explanation for why he'd been on the property, and the owner admitted afterward that this wasn't the first season he'd had a drifter hang around the rest stop longer than made sense. My son still asks if we can go back and see Grandma the long way, and every time, I tell him we're flying from now on. My grandfather had driven long-haul trucking routes his whole life, and after he passed, my uncle and I decided to retrace part of his old desert route as a way of saying goodbye, just the 2 of us in his pickup for 3 days. About 3 weeks ago, we stopped at a roadside motel he used to mention by name, a place that had barely changed since the 70s. The owner's son ran the front desk now, and told us the motel backed up to an old maintenance yard that hadn't been used in years, chain link fence and all, but the units closest to it were cheaper, so that's what we booked. He mentioned the yard gate sometimes swung open on its own in the wind, nothing to worry about. That first night, my uncle heard metal creaking out near the fence line, on and off for almost 20 minutes. He figured it was just the gate doing what the owner's son had warned us about, and didn't wake me to check. The second night, the creaking came again, except this time it was accompanied by a dragging sound moving along the fence, getting louder as it went. My uncle sat up for that one, and even he admitted the wind explanation was getting thin, but neither of us wanted to go out there in the dark to check. In the morning, we found the maintenance yard gate not just open, but the padlock that was supposed to secure it lying in the dirt, cut clean through, not broken. Someone had gone to the trouble of cutting a lock on a yard with nothing valuable inside, which meant they wanted access to the yard itself, not anything in it. There was no explanation left that made sense. That afternoon, the owner's son knocked on our door, pale, and told us a security camera mounted on the office, one he hadn't mentioned before, had picked up a man walking the fence line at almost the exact times we'd both heard the noises, 2 nights running. He turned the laptop around so we could see it ourselves. A man in dark clothing, methodically checking the fence panel by panel, like he was looking for a specific way in. That night we packed up early, planning to leave before dark, and while loading the truck, my uncle looked up and saw the same man standing at the far end of the parking lot, just watching us load our bags, making no effort to hide or leave. We didn't finish loading. We threw what we had into the cab and drove straight to the sheriff's office in the next town, where we filed a report and showed them the footage the owner's son had given us on a flash drive. Months later, the owner's son called my uncle out of nowhere. The sheriff's department had finally identified and arrested the man after a string of similar reports up and down that same stretch of highway, all near motels backing onto old maintenance yards, all matching the same method, checking fences for the easiest way in, before anyone realized he'd already found it. I still don't know what my grandfather would have made of that stretch of road looking the way it does now, but I know I'll never drive it again without checking the fence line first.
The map marked Dry Mesa as abandoned sometime in the early 70s. That was enough to convince me to drive 3 hours off the interstate with my camera and a backpack full of batteries. I made money photographing forgotten places across the American Southwest, and ghost towns always attracted viewers. Empty buildings had a way of making people imagine their own stories. The dirt road leading into town looked untouched for years. Desert shrubs had begun swallowing it whole, and a faded wooden sign leaned sideways, barely readable beneath layers of sun damage. Welcome to Dry Mesa. Population 0. Perfect. The silence surprised me first. Desert silence usually carried wind or insects. Here, nothing moved. Even my footsteps sounded strange, as if they belonged to someone walking a few feet behind me. I told myself it was just the echo from the old storefronts. Most of the buildings had collapsed roofs and shattered windows. I spent an hour taking photos, careful not to enter anything unstable. Everything looked exactly as an abandoned mining town should, except one house. It wasn't restored, but it looked maintained. The porch had been swept recently. No footprints, no tire tracks, just clean wood. I knocked anyway. No answer. The front door creaked open by itself. I stayed outside. Hello? Nothing. After another minute, curiosity beat common sense. Inside, dust covered everything except one wooden chair facing the front window. The seat looked polished from years of use. Someone had been sitting there. Recently. I photographed the room before leaving. When I checked the image on my camera screen, the chair wasn't empty. A man sat there wearing a faded denim jacket. His face was turned toward the window. I looked back into the room. The chair was empty. I checked the photo again. Still there. I blamed the camera. Heat sometimes caused strange digital artifacts. The explanation sounded weak even in my own head. I hurried outside. Across the street stood the old general store. I raised the camera. Through the viewfinder, someone watched me from inside. Lower camera. Empty building. Raise camera. Person. Lower camera. Empty again. I laughed nervously. Okay, that's enough. The desert plays tricks on people. Everyone knows that. Still, I packed my gear. As I walked toward my truck, I kept feeling watched. Not threatened, observed. Like someone waiting for me to notice them. The truck started immediately. Relief washed over me. Until I reached the end of town. The same welcome sign stood ahead. Welcome to Dry Mesa. Population 0. I frowned. I should have been miles past it. Maybe I'd taken the wrong road. I turned around. 10 minutes later, the sign again. Same cracks, same leaning post, same faded lettering. My GPS displayed a blank screen. No roads, no signal. Only a tiny blinking arrow that spun endlessly. I drove slower. Every building looked familiar now. Not because I'd photographed them, because nothing had changed. The shadows stayed in exactly the same place despite the passing time. Then I noticed the chair again. The house stood with its front door open. This time the chair wasn't empty. Neither was the porch. An elderly man stood outside, hands folded behind his back. He wasn't transparent. He wasn't frightening. He looked tired. He smiled politely and tipped an imaginary hat. I blinked. The porch was empty. That night, I somehow found the highway again, without remembering the drive. Weeks later, I developed the photographs. Every picture contained people. Miners, children, shopkeepers, families, always looking directly at me. Except one. The man in the chair never looked at the camera. He was watching the road leading out of town, as though he'd spent decades waiting for someone to prove that leaving Dry Mesa had never really been possible. I've never believed abandoned places were haunted. Dangerous? Absolutely. Unstable buildings, abandoned mine shafts, rattlesnakes, those were real threats. Ghosts were just stories people invented to explain uncomfortable feelings. That's what I told myself when I accepted a freelance assignment to photograph forgotten desert towns across Nevada. The last stop on my list was Coyote Wells. It had once been a railroad settlement before the tracks were rerouted decades earlier. Everyone left, leaving behind faded storefronts, a weather-beaten church, and a rusted water tower that still dominated the skyline. Locals at the gas station 20 miles away warned me not to stay after sunset. Not because of ghosts, because according to them, people start hearing things. I assumed they meant wind. By late afternoon, I'd already photographed most of the town. The light was perfect, casting long orange shadows across empty streets. The silence felt peaceful more than unsettling, until I heard my name, soft, almost conversational. Eric. I turned immediately. Nobody. The sound hadn't echoed. It had been close enough that I instinctively expected someone standing beside me. I laughed at myself. Hours alone in the desert could make anyone jumpy. I continued shooting. 10 minutes later, I heard it again. Eric. Exactly the same voice. Calm, patient, neither male nor female. I spun around. Nothing moved except a torn curtain fluttering inside an abandoned hotel. The rational part of my brain assembled explanations. Stress, fatigue, wind passing through broken buildings. I drank some water and kept working. The third time the voice came from above. I looked toward the water tower. No one stood on the platform. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had just stepped back out of sight. Curiosity got the better of me. The ladder was old, but solid enough to climb carefully. From the top, the entire town stretched beneath me like a forgotten photograph. Beautiful, empty, quiet. Then I noticed movement. Someone walked down Main Street. A man wearing a tan jacket. He moved slowly, stopping outside each building, before continuing toward the edge of town. I raised my camera. The street was empty through the lens. I lowered it. The man returned. Raise. Gone. Lower. Walking again. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. Instead of climbing down immediately, I watched him. He never looked at me. He simply followed the same route over and over, disappearing behind the old train depot before reappearing at the opposite end of town, always repeating, like a film caught in an endless loop. Eventually the sun dropped behind the mountains. The temperature fell almost instantly. As I descended the ladder, I heard footsteps below. Someone was climbing toward me. Metal rungs clanged one after another. I froze. Hello? The climbing stopped. Silence. I looked down. No one. Only the ladder stretching to the ground. I hurried the rest of the way. By the time my boots touched the dirt, I was breathing harder than the climb should have caused. I packed my equipment and headed for my SUV. Before opening the driver's door, I glanced back. The water tower stood against the darkening sky. Someone stood on top, watching, too far away to identify. I blinked. The platform was empty. I drove away without looking back again. A week later, while organizing my photographs, I noticed something strange. Every image from Coyote Wells included the water tower somewhere in the background. Every single one, even the close-ups, even shots taken inside buildings, and in every photograph, someone stood on the platform. The figure was always too distant to recognize, until the final image. It wasn't facing the town anymore. It was facing the camera, wearing my tan jacket. I checked the timestamp. The photo had been taken nearly an hour before I arrived in Coyote Wells. I deleted it immediately. The next morning, it was back in the folder, exactly where I'd found it. Sometimes I wonder whether I ever climbed that tower at all, or whether someone else remembered me doing it long before I got there. I wasn't chasing ghosts. I was chasing quiet. After my divorce, my therapist suggested I spend a few weeks away from cities, phones, and deadlines. I rented a four-wheel drive SUV, packed enough supplies for a week, and started driving across Arizona with no real destination. I found Ash Hollow by accident. A town wasn't marked on my GPS. I noticed an old highway sign pointing toward it, and figured it might be worth exploring before finding a campsite. There wasn't much left. A schoolhouse with broken windows, a boarded-up post office, a row of weathered homes slowly disappearing into the desert. The place looked frozen in time. Near the center of town stood a small motel. Its faded sign read, "Vacancy." I laughed. There couldn't possibly be anyone running it. Still, curiosity won. Inside the office, the furniture was covered in dust except for the reception counter. It looked clean. A brass bell sat beside an old guest register. Without thinking, I tapped it. The sound echoed through the empty building. No one came. I should have left. Instead, I noticed a key hanging behind the desk. Room 6. I convinced myself it had probably been left there decades ago. One night, in an abandoned motel, sounded like the kind of story I'd laugh about later. The room was surprisingly intact. Old furniture, faded wallpaper, a working bed frame with a clean-looking mattress that seemed oddly untouched by time. No electricity, no running water, but it felt lived in. I ate dinner from a camping stove outside before locking myself inside the room. The desert became completely silent after sunset, not peaceful, expectant. Around midnight, I woke to soft knocking, 3 slow taps. I checked my watch, 12:17. Hello? Nothing. I opened the door. The parking lot was empty beneath the moonlight. No footprints, no animals, only wind pushing sand across cracked pavement. I went back to bed. 12 minutes later, 3 knocks again. This time I ignored them. Another 12 minutes, 3 knocks. Exactly the same rhythm, exactly the same volume. By 3 in the morning, I wasn't sleeping anymore. I sat in the dark staring at the door. 12 minutes, knock. 12 minutes, knock. Every time. Just before sunrise, the knocking stopped. I stepped outside. The parking lot contained tire tracks, fresh ones. They circled the motel all night, but they never led onto the highway, only around the building. Again and again, as though someone had been driving in circles until dawn. I decided to leave immediately. While loading my SUV, I noticed something lying beneath the windshield wiper. A motel receipt. Room 6. Guest name. My name. Check-in date. Tomorrow. I laughed nervously. Someone had to be playing a prank. Except the paper wasn't new. It had yellowed with age. Ink had faded naturally. The date printed at the bottom was from 1984. Impossible. I tossed it into the passenger seat and drove away. 100 miles later, I stopped for gas. The receipt was gone. That evening, I searched online for Ash Hollow. Eventually, I found a newspaper archive. The motel had closed in 1984 after the owner disappeared. The article mentioned something else. Travelers passing through often claimed they heard knocking on motel doors during the night. Investigators believed lonely drivers had encouraged one another's stories until they became local folklore. No evidence was ever found. I almost felt relieved reading that, until I noticed a photograph attached to the article. The motel parking lot, taken the week it closed. 6 cars were parked outside. One of them was my SUV. Same scratches, same roof rack, same license plate. The picture had been published 38 years before I bought the vehicle. I enlarged the image until it became blurry. Someone stood outside room 6. The resolution wasn't clear enough to show a face, but I recognized the way he stood. One hand in his pocket, weight resting on his left foot. Exactly the posture I catch myself in whenever I'm waiting for someone to answer a door. I still wake up some nights expecting those 3 knocks, not because I think something is outside, because I'm afraid one night I'll open the door and finally meet the guest who checked into room 6 before I ever arrived. The first panic attack I ever had happened on a crowded subway in Chicago. The second happened in the middle of the Mojave Desert. I took the trip because everyone kept telling me I needed a fresh start after burning out at work. I wasn't looking for adventure. I just wanted to drive for a week without answering emails or hearing my phone buzz. By my 4th day, I'd wandered onto an old state highway that barely appeared on my map. That's where I found Black Ridge. A weather-beaten sign announced the town with peeling white paint. Beyond it sat a handful of abandoned buildings, a crumbling courthouse, and a gas station whose pumps had probably stopped working decades ago. What caught my attention wasn't the town, it was the green highway exit sign standing at the far end of the main street. Exit, 2 miles. It looked strangely new compared to everything else. Fresh reflective paint, no rust. I assumed the highway department had simply forgotten to remove it. I parked beside the old courthouse and spent the afternoon exploring. Black Ridge wasn't remarkable. It looked like dozens of other ghost towns I'd visited. Still, something felt subtly wrong. Every street seemed longer than it should have been. Every walk between buildings took more time than I expected. I blamed the heat. By sunset, I decided to leave. I drove toward the exit sign. 2 miles passed. No highway. Instead, another faded building appeared. Then the courthouse. Then the gas station. I had somehow driven back into town without turning around. I frowned and checked the GPS. No signal. The map showed my vehicle sitting in the middle of empty desert. I tried again. Same result. I stopped beside the exit sign. Maybe I'd taken the wrong road. The sign still read, exit, 2 miles. I reset the trip odometer. Exactly 2 miles later, the same sign. Not another one. The same dent on the support post. The same bullet hole near the bottom. A cold pressure settled in my chest. I told myself I was exhausted. People became disoriented in unfamiliar places all the time. I parked and waited for darkness to pass. Morning would make everything obvious. That night I slept inside the SUV with the doors locked. At some point after midnight, I woke to the sound of an engine idling nearby. Not loud, just close enough that I knew another vehicle had entered town. Relieved, I climbed out. Hello? The engine shut off. Silence. I walked toward the sound. Nothing. No headlights, no tire tracks, only empty streets glowing beneath the moon. The next morning I tried leaving on foot. If the road somehow looped, I'd eventually notice. I counted every step. At exactly 4,000 steps I reached the exit sign. 2 more miles. The courthouse. Again. The panic attack hit without warning. My breathing became shallow. My hands shook so badly I dropped my water bottle. I sat on the curb repeating the only thought that made sense. This isn't possible. An hour later, after I'd calmed down, I noticed something carved into the concrete beside me. Small letters, easy to miss. Don't follow the sign. I looked up. The exit sign stood exactly where it always had. For the first time, I ignored it. Instead of driving toward it, I turned down a narrow dirt road behind the courthouse that looked like it led nowhere. It wasn't on my map. It wasn't even wide enough to qualify as a road. After 15 minutes, the pavement finally appeared ahead. A state highway. Real traffic. Real people. I never stopped driving until I reached the next town. Months later, I mentioned Black Ridge to an elderly historian during a museum tour. He stared at me for several seconds before asking one question. Did you leave by the exit sign? I told him no. He nodded slowly. My father visited Black Ridge in 1968, he said. He came home convinced the town wanted people to leave the wrong way. I asked what he meant. He only shrugged. He said every ghost town has a memory. Most just remember the people who lived there. He paused before adding quietly, but Black Ridge remembers the people who tried to escape. I never found Black Ridge again. I've searched maps, old mining records, and historical archives. Nothing matches the place I visited. Sometimes I wonder if that's because it never existed. Other times, when I'm driving alone on unfamiliar highways, I catch sight of a green exit sign in the distance. For a split second, I expect it to read exactly what I saw that afternoon. Exit, 2 miles. Whenever that happens, I keep driving, no matter how badly I need to stop. Some roads don't lead you out. They only convince you that you're getting closer. If you've ever been truly lost in the desert, you know the silence doesn't feel empty. It feels full, like something massive is holding its breath right next to your ear, waiting for you to stop walking. 2 years ago, I decided to do a solo loop through the White Canyon Wilderness in San Juan County, Utah. It's an isolated stretch of country dominated by deep sandstone washes, towering mesa rims, and mazes of slot canyons that all look virtually identical. I wasn't a novice. I've done desert treks for over a decade, and I know the golden rule out there. You never rely on GPS alone because the canyon walls block satellite signals. You rely on physical navigation, map, compass, landmark tracking, and cairns, those small stacked piles of rocks left by previous hikers to mark the safe route through confusing washes. I started my trek around 6 in the morning, aiming for an 8-mile loop that should have taken me roughly 5 hours. The air was crisp at first, but by 10 o'clock, the heat was baking off the red rock, bouncing right back into my face. I reached the midway point of the loop, a deep, dry wash flanked by sheer 60-foot sandstone walls. To complete the circuit, I needed to take a specific left-hand turn into a secondary canyon that climbed back up toward the upper plateau. As I approached the turn, I spotted a fresh stack of 3 flat stones resting on a boulder. It was a textbook cairn. I took a quick drink from my hydration pack, checked my paper map, and followed the marker into the canyon cut. After about 20 minutes of hiking over loose gravel, the canyon walls began to narrow significantly. The gap between the rock faces went from 30 feet down to maybe 6 or 7. The light was fading fast down inside the slot, turned into a dim orange glow. That's when I noticed the footprints. I stopped in my tracks and looked down at the soft sand. There were boot prints directly in front of me, pointing deeper into the canyon. They looked fresh. The edges of the tread pattern hadn't crumbled yet from the dry wind. I bent down to inspect them and felt a sudden knot tighten in my stomach. The tread pattern on those boots was a distinct, waffle grid Vibram sole, the exact same brand and model of trail runners I was wearing. I put my right boot down right next to one of the prints. It matched the size perfectly, but what made my skin go entirely cold was the direction of the heel compression. These weren't prints from someone walking ahead of me earlier in the morning. These were my own footprints from an hour ago. But I hadn't been in this canyon yet today. I was supposed to be on a loop moving forward, not doubling back on myself. I immediately pulled out my compass. The needle swung around, and my heart sank. I was heading dead north. To be on my loop back to the trailhead, I should have been moving southwest. Someone hadn't just built a random marker back at the wash. Someone had deliberately knocked down the original trail cairn pointing southwest and built a new one at the mouth of this dead-end slot canyon. They wanted whoever came down that wash to turn in here. I turned around on my heel, my heart hammering against my ribs, and started retracing my steps back toward the main wash as fast as I could walk. The canyon was eerily quiet, save for the crunch of my own boots on the loose stone. Then, about halfway back to the canyon entrance, I heard a sound that made me freeze in my tracks. It was a sharp, metallic clack. It came from directly above me. I slowly tilted my head back to look up at the high canyon rim 60 feet overhead. The bright blue sky was just a thin ribbon between the dark sandstone edges. For a second, I saw nothing, just empty rock. Then, a small pebble bounced off the wall 3 feet to my right and clattered onto the gravel at my feet. A second later, another pebble dropped, hitting the ground right behind my left boot. Someone was standing on the rim directly above my head, and they weren't trying to hide. They were watching me, dropping stones to mark exactly where I was in the narrow gap below them. I didn't yell. I didn't ask who was up there. When you're alone in a place where no one can hear you for 20 miles, making noise just proves how helpless you are. I simply kept my eyes glued to the upper rim, grabbed my hiking poles like weapons, and broke into a fast, awkward jog down the narrow floor of the slot. Every few seconds, another rock would drop from above. They weren't throwing heavy stones to hurt me. They were dropping little handfuls of dirt and pebbles, methodically tracking my exact pace from the top of the canyon wall. The sound of small stones skittering off the sandstone echoed like gunshots in that confined space. When I finally reached the mouth of the slot canyon where it emptied back into the main wash, I stopped behind a massive fallen boulder to break their line of sight. My breath was ragged, and the heat in the wash felt like an oven. I peeked around the side of the rock, staring up at the plateau where the person had to be standing. Nothing moved. The sun was blazing down, casting razor-sharp shadows across the red rock. Whoever it was had stayed high on the rim, completely hidden in the glare. I didn't waste time trying to figure out their game. I pulled out my map, ignored the altered cairns entirely, and used my compass to cut a straight line southwest, scrambling directly over open, unmaintained terrain. I skipped the trail completely, wedging my hands and boots into hazardous sandstone cracks, scaling steep, crumbling ledges, just to keep moving toward the ridge that overlooked the distant dirt road where my truck was parked. I didn't stop for water. I didn't check the time. I just moved as fast as my legs would carry me, constantly looking over my shoulder at the high rocks behind me. Every silhouette of a dead desert bush or a standing rock pillar looked like a person watching me leave. It took me 3 brutal hours of cross-country scrambling to finally see the white roof of my truck glinting in the sun at the trailhead. When I reached the driver's door, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hit the unlock button on my key fob. I threw my pack into the back seat, slammed the door, locked it, and flooded the engine, kicking up a cloud of red dust as I tore down the dirt access road toward the highway. It wasn't until I reached a paved gas station 2 hours later in Moab that I finally allowed myself to take a deep breath and sit down on the tailgate. The adrenaline was finally wearing off, leaving my muscles feeling like lead. I unzipped the top brain compartment of my pack to pull out my wallet. Sitting right on top of my map, tucked inside a folded clear zip-top bag, was a clean piece of lined paper that had not been there when I started my hike that morning. I opened it with trembling fingers. Written in black permanent marker was a set of GPS coordinates, followed by a simple, hand-drawn map of my home neighborhood 300 miles away in Salt Lake City, with a small black cross marked over my exact street address. They had never intended to trap me in that canyon to die of exposure. They had altered the trail markers to slow me down long enough to slip that note into my pack while I was resting. Heat delirium makes you see water that isn't there. It doesn't make you hear your own voice calling for help from 50 yards behind you. My buddy Mark and I had hiked 5 miles into the Mojave National Preserve to set up a primitive campsite near a massive, isolated granite monolith. It was late October, meaning the days were warm, and the nights were dead silent and pitch black, perfect conditions for astrophotography. By 9 at night, the temperature dropped into the low 50s, and the sky turned into an incredible, unbroken sheet of bright stars. Our camp was basic, a 2-person tent pitched about 20 feet from the sheer, cracked base of the granite rock face. The monolith itself was enormous, stretching nearly 80 feet into the night air, full of deep alcoves, wind-carved caves, and narrow vertical fissures. We spent the first couple of hours running long exposure shots on our tripods. By midnight, the desert air was dead calm. There was no wind, not even a gentle breeze to rustle the dry scrub brush. It was that absolute heavy silence where you can hear the ringing in your own ears. Mark crawled into the tent first, exhausted from the trek in, and was fast asleep within 10 minutes. I stayed outside for a bit longer, tweaking my camera settings to capture a time lapse of the Milky Way. Around 1 in the morning, I was sitting on a folding camp stool, staring at the glowing screen of my camera, when a sound came from the darkness near the base of the rock. It was a voice. Quiet, but completely clear. "Hey man, hand me that water bottle, will you?" I froze. The voice had come from a narrow gap in the granite about 30 yards to my left. It didn't sound like a stranger. It sounded identical to Mark. The exact same cadence, tone, and rasp he gets when his throat is dry. I slowly turned my head toward the tent. The zip-up door was fully closed. Through the thin nylon, I could clearly hear Mark snoring, long and steady. A cold prickle hit the back of my neck. I stood up, keeping my eyes fixed on the dark shadow of the rock fissure. "Mark?" I called out, keeping my voice low. The snoring inside the tent stopped for a second, then resumed. Then, from inside the dark rock crevice, the voice spoke again. "Hey man, hand me that water bottle, will you?" It was the exact same sentence, spoken with the exact same tone, inflection, and pacing. It wasn't an echo. It was a literal, millisecond for millisecond playback of a sentence Mark had said to me hours earlier while we were setting up the tent during the afternoon hike. I backed up until my heels hit the edge of my tent. I reached down, grabbed a heavy tactical flashlight from my gear bag, and clicked the beam on, shining 3,000 lumens straight into the mouth of the rock crack. The bright white light cut through the dark, illuminating bare, dusty granite walls, and a dead-end pocket of stone about 15 feet deep. There was nothing inside, no animal, no hiker, no speaker, just empty, solid rock. Then, the sound shifted. It didn't come from that crevice anymore. From 3 different places along the granite wall, 1 high up near the top of the monolith, and 2 near the ground on opposite sides of our camp, voices started coming out of the dark simultaneously. It was my voice this time. "Did you hear that?" My own voice whispered from the top of the rock face. "Did you hear that?" Another clone of my voice echoed from the brush behind my tent. And then, from high above us, a sound broke out that made my blood run entirely cold. It was the sound of Mark's voice, but it wasn't repeating casual sentences anymore. It was screaming in absolute shrill panic, begging for help at the top of his lungs, mixing with the sound of frantically gasping for air. I unzipped the tent flap so fast I ripped the nylon mesh. I grabbed Mark by the shoulder and shook him violently. He woke up confused and disoriented, but the moment his eyes opened, he went pale. The sound of his own voice screaming for help was still bouncing off the granite rocks outside, coming from 3 different directions at once. "What is that?" he choked out, looking around the dark interior of the tent in pure terror. "Is that me?" "We're leaving," I said. "Now. Don't worry about the tent. Grab your pack and the keys." We scrambled out into the night. The moment my boots hit the dirt, the voices abruptly stopped. The silence fell so hard it was deafening. But as we put our headlamps on and began frantically grabbing our essential gear, a new sound started up inside the rock face. It wasn't a voice anymore. It was a rhythmic, wet clicking sound, like heavy stones grinding against each other inside a deep, flooded cavern. It started low, then began moving along the base of the monolith, tracking right alongside us as we backed away from the camp. We abandoned the tent, the sleeping bags, and our heavy camera tripods. The only thing I grabbed besides my pack was my small digital audio recorder, which had been running on a tripod near the rock face all night to capture ambient night sounds for my time-lapse videos. I snatched it off the mount, shoved it into my pocket, and we turned our backs on the monolith. We didn't follow the trail back. In the pitch black, with whatever that was pacing us from the dark rock formations, staying on a narrow path felt like a trap. I pulled out my Lensatic compass, locked it onto a straight western bearing toward the access road, and we ran. For 2 straight hours, we trekked through the open desert scrub under the starlight, taking turns looking over our shoulders. Every time our headlamps caught the movement of a tall Joshua tree or a shadow shifting over a rock, my heart jumped into my throat. The desert was completely quiet around us, but I couldn't shake the heavy, suffocating feeling that we were being watched from the high ridge lines all the way back to the truck. We reached the road at 3 in the morning, threw our gear into the bed, and drove straight back to a motel in Barstow without stopping once. It wasn't until the sun came up the next morning that we finally built up the courage to pull out my digital audio recorder. I plugged my headphones into the jack, set the device on the desk, and hit play. The recording was clean for the first few hours, just the wind rustling through the scrub and our footsteps around camp. Then came the section where Mark and I fled, followed by 20 minutes of absolute silence after we ran away. Then, at timestamp 1:42 a.m., the microphone picked up the sound of something heavy dragging itself out from a deep crevice in the rock, stepping down onto our abandoned campsite. For 3 hours straight, the recorder captured a low, raspy voice sitting right next to the microphone. It wasn't just repeating what we had said that day. It was reciting full, detailed conversations that Mark and I had in the truck on the drive home to Los Angeles late the next evening, down to the exact street names, the specific gas stations we stopped at, and the precise time we finally unlocked the front door to my apartment. The worst part about the salt flats isn't the suffocating heat. It's that for 10 miles in every direction, there's nowhere to hide, which means whatever is tracking you has nowhere to hide either. It was late November when I set out to cross a 12-mile stretch of Badwater Basin on the fringe of Death Valley. Autumn in the basin is deceptively pleasant. The air hovers around 70 degrees, and the blinding, crusty salt pan stretches out like a vast, frozen ocean under a pale blue sky. It's a landscape stripped of everything. No trees, no boulders, no elevation changes. Just an endless white plain bordering a distant ridge of black, jagged volcanic rock. I was 3 hours into the trek, totally isolated, with the highway long gone behind the horizon. The silence out there is thick, broken only by the sharp, glass-like crunch of your own boots breaking through the salt crust. Around noon, I stopped to take a drink and scan the horizon behind me with my binoculars. I wasn't expecting to see anyone. Crossing the open salt pan off-trail is rare, even for experienced hikers. When I brought the lenses to my eyes, my breath caught in my throat. Roughly 2 miles back, standing dead center on the white expanse, was a human silhouette. It was an impossible sight. The person was standing perfectly upright, completely motionless, dressed in dark clothing that contrasted sharply against the blinding salt. No backpack, no hiking gear, no sun hat. Just a thin, dark figure standing in the middle of nowhere. I lowered the binoculars, blinked against the glare, and looked again. They hadn't moved an inch. I told myself it was probably another long-distance trekker taking a breather, turned around, and kept walking. But after 10 minutes, a weird, prickling sensation took over the back of my neck. I stopped again and whirled around with the binoculars. The silhouette was still there, but the distance hadn't changed. I had been maintaining a brisk 4-mile-an-hour pace, yet the figure was still precisely 2 miles behind me. That meant the moment I had started walking again, they had matched my speed down to the second. To test it, I took 20 fast, hurried steps forward, then abruptly stopped and spun around. Through the magnified lenses, I saw the figure freeze in mid-stride, dropping into the exact same motionless stance. They were mirroring me. Every time I moved, they moved. Every time I paused, they paused. A cold wave of dread washed over me, completely cutting through the midday sun. Out on the salt flats, scale and distance are terrifyingly broken. There were no park rangers, no cell service, and no cover. Just me, a figure on the horizon, and 4 long miles of flat salt between me and the volcanic rock fields that led to the road. I stopped playing games. I turned north toward the rock fields, locked my gaze forward, and broke into a fast, steady power walk. For 20 minutes, all I heard was the rapid, rhythmic crunch, crunch, crunch of my boots. I resisted the urge to look back, focusing entirely on the dark, jagged line of the volcanic hills growing larger in front of me. Then, the sound changed. Behind me, far in the distance, came a new noise cutting through the still desert air. It wasn't a steady walking cadence anymore. It was a fast, wet, heavy slapping sound, like bare feet sprint tackling the hard salt crust at full speed. I didn't turn around immediately. I just started running. My heavy pack bounced violently against my shoulders, and my boots hammered into the fragile salt crust, breaking through into the damp, chemical mud beneath. Sweat immediately began stinging my eyes, but I didn't dare slow down to wipe it away. When I finally risked a glance over my shoulder, my stomach plummeted. The figure wasn't 2 miles back anymore. They had closed half the distance in a matter of minutes, and they weren't running directly toward me. They were sprinting in a massive, wide arc across the blinding salt pan, moving with an unsettling, fluid speed that didn't seem humanly possible across that uneven, treacherous surface. They were deliberately pacing ahead of my trajectory, moving to cut me off before I could reach the safety of the volcanic rock field ahead. Through the heat haze, I could see details now. It was a tall, gaunt man, dressed in filthy, sun-bleached dark clothes. His arms were hanging limply at his sides, swinging wildly with his stride, and his head was locked in a fixed, unnatural tilt, staring straight at me as he ran. Panic hit me like a physical blow. I unclipped my chest strap, dropped my heavy backpack right onto the salt, and sprinted full force toward the nearest pile of jagged black basalt rocks. The crunching of my boots turned into a panicked scramble as I reached the edge of the salt flat and hit the rough, sharp incline of the volcanic debris. I clawed my way up the dark, crumbling rock face, shredding my palms on the glass-sharp edges, not daring to look back until I reached a narrow ledge 20 feet up. I turned around, gasping for air, clutching a heavy, sharp piece of basalt in my right hand, ready to fight for my life. The flat salt expanse below me was completely empty. There was no one sprinting across the plain, no figure standing in the heat haze, just miles and miles of untouched, blinding white salt stretching back toward the horizon. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard it was painful. I scanned every inch of the open flats for fully 10 minutes, holding my breath, but the entire valley floor was dead silent. I didn't wait around to investigate. I scrambled through the volcanic rocks, hauled myself over the ridge, and burst out onto the dirt shoulder of Highway 178, just as an empty National Park Service truck was driving past. I threw both hands in the air, screaming and waving like a madman, until the ranger slammed on his brakes and pulled over. I collapsed against the side of his truck, hyperventilating, trying to explain that someone had just chased me down across the basin from 2 miles out. The ranger listened calmly, pulled out a pair of high-powered binoculars, and walked with me to the edge of the ridge, overlooking the salt flats where I had just dropped my pack. He adjusted the focus, looked out across the basin for a long moment, and then slowly handed the binoculars to me, without saying a word. I brought the lenses to my eyes and zoomed in on my bright red backpack sitting abandoned on the white salt plain. Leading up to my pack was a single, clear line of my own heavy boot prints coming from the south. There were no other foot tracks near my bag, no running footprints, no bare feet in the salt mud. Except right at the spot where I had dropped my pack, waiting right beside my bag on the flat, undisturbed salt, was a small, neat pile of fresh, black volcanic rocks, stacked in the exact same formation as the cairns back on the trail, pointing directly up the ridge toward where I was now standing with the ranger.